Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. This week's episode is a discussion of the cultural products of white liberal guilt and their use and efficacy or lack thereof. My guest today is Liam Bright. Liam is a philosopher of science at the London School of Economics, but has also written on a number of topics, including the culture war and discourse norms that are of a lot of interest to me. Indeed, I kind of feel like I've known Liam for years. I've been reading his stuff and I've cited it in my own work for a long time now. And he's also engaged with some of my work as well, but we've never actually talked. So this was really great to be able to sit down with him and kind of compare notes after reading each other's stuff for a while. It's going to be 2 episodes. My increasing thought with whether to divide long conversations up is less about like the length and more about, are they one conversation or do they break down into discrete units? So like my conversation with Alec Chrisman, very long conversation, but that was one conversation about sort of one set of topics. Whereas this is essentially 2 completely separate ones. So some people might be interested in one and not the other, or vice versa. The first one, like I say, White Psychodrama Revisited, that's this one. And then next time we'll be putting in conversation a piece of mine, the Why the Democratic Tea Party Failed, and a piece of Liam's, There Will Be No Message Discipline. And the reason for that is people who've read both have put them in conversation, and people have often, in response to my article, asked me to respond to Liam's. So it just seemed like a really interesting experiment to just have the 2 authors chat it out. So that'll be next time. Until then, let's get straight to this week's episode. As always, if you'd like to support the show, please do support it. Please do so on Patreon, patreon.com/political philosophy podcast. And thank you, by the way. I've not really a team behind the podcast. I've got some more people supporting recently, which is amazing. Thank you so much for that. I'll also mention I've started doing a newsletter with just updates from the show and my writing and whatever else is going on. You can sign up for that on the website, politicalphilosophypodcast.com, politicalphilosophypodcast.com. Apart from that, let's get to this week's episode. This is White Psychodrama Revisited with Liam Bright. Okay, so I am joined today by Liam Bright. Liam, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Pleasure to be here, Toby.
Can we start with, there's a few pieces you've written that have sort of stayed with me, and also that people share at me as when I have like particular takes. They're like, what about this? Can we start
I'm so
with
sorry. Okay, go.
I don't know what it is about both of us. This is a bit of an aside, but we've both written stuff that people use offensively. Your message discipline one would be another one, where it's not like, read this, it's great. It's like, you're really wrong, go fuck yourself, read what Toby wrote. And I don't know what that is.
Yeah, I don't know if I presume I hope it's nothing about us in particular. It's just the nature of online, but who knows?
Maybe we just have a particularly sort of feisty disposition or something. I don't know.
Maybe we're just terrible and we attract terrible people. I think that could not should not be out.
That could also be it. So, one of them that I thought was good and that people have shared with me since is the White Psychodrama piece. This was 2003, I want to say, a couple of years ago.
2023, because 2003 was more than a couple of years ago. I regret to inform you.
That would have been a long time ago, yes,
It's been a,
2003.
yeah.
Um, so in this, you give a sort of schema for the culture war as essentially white people pathologies. Do you want to give us a start with what you see as like the origin of that?
So, the paper White Psychodrama is, yes, as you say, it's an attempt to um, say what I think is underlying prominent cultural disputes, especially about race and especially about race in America. Caveat on that in a moment. And More or less, my theory of the case is that there's a sort of mismatch between a broadly shared ideology and readily observable empirical facts. And so there's a sort of broadly shared post-civil rights movement in America, post-broader decolonial movement in the mid and latter half of the 20th century. There's a sort of shared sense that people are equals. It was very bad indeed that once upon a time we had explicit racial caste hierarchies, more or less. And it's very good that we no longer do that, and we should stop, and it's we should punish deviations from that. It's very bad to be racist or prejudiced. At the same time, it's extremely readily observable that pretty clearly the former slaves have basically ended up worse off in this society by a whole bunch of metrics. It's not, you know, that's not a coincidence or something. Like, it's not just a coincidence that the British colonized Nigeria and now BP own the oil in Nigeria, right? This is like there's a causal relationship between that past and the present inequalities. And doing things about it would involve massive redistribution away from us, more or less, the dominant Western countries, and then within those countries, on average, on net, the white people. And that people don't want that. And so what happens is a kind of like, well, how do you square those two things? And I sort of got the sense that there was a kind of uh a split happening in how you square those things. Where one strategy, which I called repenter, is more or less to acknowledge this and feel, and to sincerely inhabit like a sense of regret and sincerely felt dislike for this inequality, and to try and ameliorate the tensions that arise because of it. So adopt cultural standards and rituals which really evince respect for black people if you're white, and non-white, well, other non-white peoples, former colonized peoples as well, and to try and make it very, very clear that you do not think the people at the bottom end of this hierarchy are worse than you, that you don't think this is like deserved or anything like that. And if anyone does anything to like overt signs of racism, which of course still exist, like overt prejudice, like people just disliking black or non-white people because they're black or non-white, punish those really, really hard to evince that you do not approve of this. Um, and in that way, try and make it such that like, you've at least shown that despite the persistent material inequalities one enjoys, you have made it clear that you have not thereby come to endorse the old hierarchies which led to this. And the other strategy is more or less to, like, which I called the repressor, is to sort of try and go all in on like actually, it's not a coincidence, the wrong word, but like it's really putting the emphasis in the wrong place to stress the continuation of now from the past de jure racism and empire and so on. Like really, 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 like progress has been made. We can expect progress. Maybe we're living in a transitional moment where like right now it looks bad, but it will get better and it's much better than it was in the past. And where there are lasting inequalities, maybe that's because now maybe the poor blacks really are just behaving worse. And like that's a different kind of thing, right? Like, and so there all the emphasis is being placed on like, look, all you're doing by bringing the past up is preventing integration, right? Because you're making it awkward between people.
Mm.
What we should instead be trying to do is moving past these things by like stressing the progress, expecting it to continue in future, um, and in general, sort of like stressing discontinuities between now and sort of repressing any sense of guilt or shame, because after all, why should I feel guilty or shame? We're not in the bad old days. We're in the good days now. We're in the better days at least. And the problem is that these two strategies just directly conflict, because one of these strategies involves making it really, really clear that you can see the bad things and you acknowledge that and you're sorry about it and you are not letting that make you think worse of other non-white people. And the other strategy involves like not doing that, like not bringing those things up. If anything, stressing what's good about nowadays and compared to the bad old days. And this means that when those two groups of people inhabit the same cultural spaces, they want exactly the opposite thing out of those cultural spaces, and they fight a bunch about it. And my point in this is that these are both, in the end, um, strategies designed to soothe the tensions felt by people benefiting from the current inequalities, which largely means wealthier white people. And when I did review at least some statistics on who takes part in the culture war, like who's actually getting in fights online about these kind of things, and it's two sides of basically upper middle class white people, like that's who's fighting here. And so I think it matches, if I'm right about the psychology and the strategies being adopted, and it is indeed the people you'd expect to feel that tension. So that's what I think is going on. And if I'm right about that, I also think it suggests that there's a sense in which neither side winning that debate really advances the interests of poor and non-white people, because in the end, both a means of managing the tensions caused by a persistent inequality, not of reducing the inequality. The caveats on that are first, that it is largely a US phenomena, but the US is overwhelmingly culturally dominant in many, many places beyond the US. And so features of what happens in the US culturally gets spread in various ways to non-US places. And so I don't actually think, although there are elements of this which are idiosyncratic to US history, like for instance, the importance placed on the civil rights movement of the 60s,
Mm.
uh, nonetheless, I think probably, I mean, certainly I think in the UK, elements of this are recognizable. I think in France, I think from I know friends from Brazil, elements of this can be recognizable. So I don't think it's just,
Certainly in the UK.
yeah, exactly right. So I don't think it's just US, even though I would, it's in many ways dominated by the US. And the second caveat is, I'd never ever thought, and I'm careful to say this in the paper, and I think one misread people have had, I've never thought that the kind of we all agree that racism is bad characterizes like literally everyone.
Mm.
The domain of quantification there is everyone involved in these debates.
Mm.
Um, there is, of course, just straightforward, unrepented, like, no, de jure racism was good and we should bring it back. Um, by proportion of the population, those people are still, even to this day, a minority, although worryingly they might be growing. Um, but in terms of their political clout, those people are on the upswing right now. Mate, you got to be careful when doing this thing to not assume that this means that the supporters of actual de jure explicit prejudice, that they're just gone or down and out for the count. They're not.
To put it in my own words, the disconnect between ideology and sort of actual material circumstance, which is linked to that history. That's sort of the origin. And it's people, white people's feelings about that in a way that's actually untethered from a concern about black people or anyone else. It's how we feel about our awkwardness that is in some ways the psychological driver in your account.
Yeah, I mean, yes, yes, right. So I think that, as I said, it's coming out of, yeah, just as you said. I will say, like, I don't mean, and again, I do try and say this in the paper, I don't mean to suggest that everyone's like totally cynical and actually they genuinely don't care about um non-white people or anything like that. I think that it's just the source of the tension is just they might have those concerns, but they also have other, and I think perfectly normal concerns. Like, in the end, people like having stuff, and they don't like it if like changing a thing would mean them having less stuff. And the culture comes out of like, well, whatever concern I have about the awkwardness of the situation, it's paired with I want more stuff, not less stuff. And so I've got to like manage. If the ideal for me would be there would be some way to like reconcile sincere moral concerns, like endorsing the anti-racist moral order, with also, you know, not beginning a process of, 40 acres and a mule to every black person in America, like I don't want to do that either. And so like it's that's the tension. And so yes, you are correct. I do think it's about managing the feelings of, awkward, wealthier white people. But I want to stress that I'm not saying that those people don't also they're not insincere. I don't think that people are lying about.
My view is even quite bad political actors usually aren't straightforwardly deceptive. They believe what they're saying on some level, even if they're easing themselves past potential contradictions. I mean, from my like perspective as like the white liberal, so I'm very much in, I guess, by your schema, the repenter camp, right? Like, I perhaps wouldn't endorse every claim you ascribe to them, but like certainly, like I have a team in the culture war, and that's my team, right? I think there's a good deal of truth to that. Maybe, as you say, it's not the only thing that's going on, and there perhaps are white liberals who are, no, there are who will sign up to some of the more material stuff. But I think, I mean, I'll tell you a story I told Olafemi Taiwo, who I know you know,
The other one, right?
yeah, the global reparations, and I was in, the peak woke years, the early 2010s, working for a number of liberal causes like gay marriage. I worked for Amnesty International for a bit. So I was like center of the bullseye for this sort of stuff. And we had a lot of sort of conversations about workplace diversity, so on and so forth. And even in those very liberal spaces, you could bring up legitimate issues. And I just remember on any number of occasions, we'd all just go round the room and talk about how it made us feel. And
Mm.
you'd get these white people, well-meaning, who would go, I feel so bad, and I acknowledge my privilege, and I've listened and I've learned. And then they'd stop talking. And to my mind, like if you want to talk about workplace diversity, there's actually some basic stuff like you might want to, in an age where higher education costs an increasing amount, we might want to look at the fact that do all our jobs really need a degree requirement? Stuff like that. We might want to look at our hiring processes. We might want to look about what we think internal advancement looks like, these sorts of things.
Mhm.
But it was always just these they've been parodied, perhaps unfairly, as sort of struggle sessions, but you talk very much about your feelings of guilt, and that was sort of what. But in a sense, that's what that culture asked of people. That's what you were being asked to do, you know. And so
Yeah,
I don't think saying it's all like a sort of white neurosis and self-regard is like it's maybe not the whole story, and maybe it's unfair to some white liberals, I think. I'd hope it's at least somewhat unfair to me, for instance, but it's not like that thing doesn't exist, I think, would be my perspective.
yeah. Well, I mean, there are still bits of that paper I stand by, and yeah, that this psychodrama occurs and is a significant driver of events is one of those things. And like, yeah, the kind of things you just mentioned, like it's easy in some sense to see what they're doing, right? They're cathartic. There are feelings that build up around this issue, and there are social rituals to manage the the tensions thus introduced. And like, if this was happening in another society and an anthropologist was observing it and describing it, we wouldn't even find it that difficult to recognize that like that's
Hmm.
the thing happening here. And I mean, I've seen anthropologists writing about rituals in smaller scale hunter-gatherer societies where people where they kill animals, but more people are more involved in the business,
Hmm.
proportionally more people are more involved in the business of like living with living in the midst of the animals, then eventually one day killing and eating them.
Mm.
And a lot of ritual goes into like making that acceptable to people,
Hmm.
dealing with the feelings that introduces. And like the anthropologist doesn't have difficulty recognizing like, well, that's what's happening here. And
Mm.
I think that's the same. Like people have the experience of living amidst these tensions, these inequalities, and they have developed means of dealing with the emotions that's introduced. And that's why the language of repressor and repenter, like the repressor, at least half of that, is meant to be inducing like the kind of the psychological function I think is happening there. It's like pushing the feelings down rather than the cathartic moment of repenting.
I think there's, yeah, like I said, I think there's at least something to it. I mean, I think it's kind of it's a fair sketch of many sort of affluent white liberals. I guess the criticism of the paper would come, as you already alluded to, in the sort of are you being perhaps too charitable to the other side? But as you've already said, the other side, it's fine to knock the white liberals, but could we have been meaner to the
I
repressors?
I have had one of the amusing things about this paper is I have had a number of people respond to it by telling me that they thought that I was, maybe fair enough about their side, but I was too harsh. I was too light on the other side in just ways. And I've had that from people who identify with both.
Really?
Yeah. Um, and
So
I've
you've
also,
had like conservatives say, look, yeah, you kind of have us down, but these liberals, man.
yeah, yeah, because I think people can typically sort of recognize some degree of like, yeah, no doubt there's a bit of that, right? Like,
Yeah,
I get it, we're doing this.
yeah,
But
yeah.
like they will want to stress first, it's not like that's the only thing we're doing, which I actually agree with. And then second, the bits where you've attributed like it's a reasonable motive to those guys, I don't agree. Like I
Mm,
actually think they're just a cynical thing. Like that's actually a reasonably common response. I will say that this is why I was constantly. We've talked about the white people side. In some sense, the motive for me writing the paper and the other common response I get, the real villains of the piece are people I haven't mentioned so far, which is the POC intelligentsia, is the group which I identify myself in
mm,
the paper, right? And so I say that the the material inequality means persisting material inequality, which generates this tension, means that a lot of like gatekeeping positions, either like access to capital via like being a fancy person at a bank handing loans out, um, or access to professional middle class jobs in terms of who are the people deciding who gets hired and promoted. That's being done by the white people with the psychology I just
mm,
mentioned. But there has been improvements, and there's been enough material improvements that there is now a burgeoning POC professional managerial class or petty bourgeois, like wanting access to capital.
mm,
And, we have to go via persuading those gatekeepers to give us stuff, give us the position, right? Because that's how gatekeeping works.
mm,
Um, and a number of us have responded, and I think with a sort of admirable entrepreneurial spirit of like a working out that like, oh, this is an exploitable psychology, and I can get stuff out of the white people
mm,
by playing card. And so like I think in academia, typically the better play is to work out how to make the repenters do what you want. Not only, but it's typically the better play. Um, there is a large like conservative media space where the better play is working out how to get the repressors to give you what you want. There is also like subdomains of this. Like there is very much a left repressor space, where this is where people outside of the group would call them class reductionists, and there is a way of being the a favored intellectual to the class reductionist leftists by being a black person who appeals
mm.
to like left repressor tendencies. I don't know if they're being right repenters. It's harder to see how that could happen, but if there was, I bet there'd be, we
You've identified a niche in the market, certainly.
exactly. You've identified a niche in the market created by this emotional dynamic, and there are all sorts of ways of appealing to that and making a career out of it. I mean, and even sometimes I think people act with self-conscious class interests as POC intelligentsia. So my favorite bit in the paper, my two favorite bits in the paper are one bit where I say that mediocre but quick-witted POC academics have been able to exploit this by selling the wisdom of previous black thinkers or non-white thinkers to the white people, and then I give an example of my own paper. I had to like sneak that past reviewers, and I'm very proud of myself for sneaking. Sorry, editor of Journal of Political Philosophy, but I did that. And the other bit is a quote from Saira Rao, who now might be a bit of a forgotten figure, but she is I don't know how to describe her. Right? She did the Race to Dinner project, where the Race to Dinner project is aimed
I
specifically.
find this a stunning cultural artifact. Go
I know
ahead.
of the woke era. This is going to be like, I hope future historians. I hope it's being documented well, so future historians can
Yeah,
look.
because I'm maybe vaguely more sympathetic to this than you. Like, I think you gave Woke, and we'll get into this, a 4 out of 10. I'm like a 6 out of 10. Like, maybe it did more good than harm if you squint, maybe. But the race to dinner thing, so explain it.
So this is Saira Rao and the buddy. The business model changed over time, but like the initial like pure version of it was Saira Rao and a buddy. You invite them for dinner, and it's only aimed at white women, so you have to be a white woman, and it's like expensive. It's like $5,000. I think it was like a very high number. Um, and you invite them to dinner, preferably with like a friend. So it's like a little bit of like a house party, it's a small
Mm.
dinner party. Like I think it was like 5 to 6 people, so like £1,000 each. Um, and you cook them dinner, so £1,000 plus the expenses for the dinner, I guess. So you cook them dinner, and they meanwhile like tell you what a bastard you are. And like it was very much the marketing about it was like, I will come in and I will like explain how racist you are. I, expect to be crying. I expect to be get defensive, and like I will like, no mercy, right? I will push through
Mm.
this. And so it's like advertised as like pay me money to show up and then cook dinner for me while I make you and your friends cry by telling you you're horrible people. And the thought was that this experience was, I don't know, I mean, in some ways would contribute to you being less racist in the future, I guess, because I don't know, the prospect of Sarah Rao turning up to your house again is so miserable that you'll just be less racist to avoid it. I don't know. Like, who knows, right? Like somehow that would make you less racist. And what's wonderful is there's a quote from I think Sarah Rao or Associate, I forget which one, um, which I found in the piece, where they expressly say that they don't want white people doing things which would like more materially reduce inequalities. They want
That's
like
white saviorism.
that be white
Good.
saviors. That's the quote, right? Like, and like, so it's like amazing. You have like $5,000 spare. And the claim is the best thing you could do for anti-racism is giving Saira Rao and her buddy. Rao is herself a very wealthy person. $5,000 for an evening. Where she tells you you're busted, and it's sort of like there's no way. Like the degree of like anti people on the left can argue about how materialist we should be, but the degree of anti-materialism you'd have to think this is the best use of your money and time on anti-racist purposes is wild. And I think really the better way of understanding this is Saira Rao understands her business model. Her business model is crucially relying on this there being wealthy people in a system which is unequal in this kind of way. And please do not change that fact, keep at it, right? And so like I take her to just be a clever entrepreneur in this space who worked out that there's a kind of, I mean, it feels almost erotic, right? Like a sort of like a
I had that thought, but I didn't see
yeah,
it.
yeah, it feels which is, this is fine, people can be into what they're into, but like it's almost erotic domination experience you're getting out.
There's an element of how we play with domination sexually
Like,
there. There
yeah,
has
like,
to
and so
be.
like it's obviously not
But
the only thing going on, but like that's the best way I can explain it because it's just otherwise such bizarre behavior. And like in any case, right, like that as a cultural aspect, I think like in
you
some ways, Sarah was just unusually explicit about a thing which I think a lot of people have felt. And subsequent to me writing this paper, the book uh Yellowface by Rebecca Kwong came out. And that book is about, in like the literary world, it's like a complex dynamic. I won't go into it, but it's sort of about these dynamics of appealing to white gatekeepers, but where this dynamic is in the background and it's really good.
Mm,
The film, which is itself based on a book, American Fiction, came out, which is also again a literary world explanation of this. And it did make me think, like, I around the same time, post, in the era of woke, there were enough people like me who were realizing, and all of these have the feature which my paper has, of like all of us, the kind of people who are in a position to write these papers or write these books or get these films made, all of us are ourselves the POC intelligentsia kind of benefiting from this system. So we're sort of biting the hands that feed us here. As we all kind of shamefacedly acknowledged it a bit in the medium we had available to
mm.
us. So I do think that many of us realized, uh, you know, we're sort of participating in a bad thing here and we're benefiting from it and are
But
hoping.
at least in some cases, isn't there sincere belief there? Because that was one of the questions I had reading your paper, is if I think about the most quote unquote woke people I've met, they're by no means all white, you know. Like I think
Yeah,
that
yeah. The paper
I
is
think
about and
particularly
aimed
for
at the
like
POC intelligentsia. Like that's who the
yeah,
paper's for. And so
yeah.
it's not really aimed at the white people. I'm theorizing the white pe people for the sakes of the non-white people.
Yeah, but like, do you think? I think when you talk about like Cerebral, there must. I mean, I don't know. I'm not in anyone else's head, so I shouldn't judge. But if you told me there was an element of self-conscious deception there, I wouldn't disbelieve you. If there was an element of like she
Just
sort
enough
of
to keep
knew
it.
she was getting away with something a bit. But then when I think about a lot of people I've met in activist spaces, they're certainly picking up and using this language. But I don't think insincerely. I think they've absorbed it and they believe it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, two things, three things, I'd say. Um, One, I do think there is a degree of sincere belief, and this is why I also think of Femi's Elite Capture, which also came around the same time. I really do think there was like a cultural moment when these things were all,
Yeah.
and Femi's Elite Capture, because I think that there's a sort of relatively easy move to make wherein like the following chain of thought, like, well, what's anti-racism about, right? It's about improving the position of non-white people in our society, and I'm a non-white person. And so something like me self-advocating and me advocating anti-racistly, there's a genuine alignment there. Like it's just there is a reason to think those two things are related. And so I think it's easy to like totally non-cynically just see performing the role of POC intelligentsia relative to this thing as completely sincerely an anti-racist project, which you were doing for anti-racist reasons, and it's good when it pays out. You should worry about that for the reasons Femi explains in Elite Capture. The social consequences of doing that thing are exactly to pick out a non-representative sample of non-white people and give them incentives misaligned with the advancement of non-white people in general. But that's not obvious from the inside, and I don't think people are always cynically misleading things. I will say of my past self, I name myself in this villain group, right? And I, the best I can say for myself is sometimes I was that as well. That delusion struck me at some point in my life. So I think that's one thing. Another thing I would say is there's a sort of other all the way in cynical view, which kind of comes out non-cynical in a sense. The other all the way cynical view is like, there is just this is the best we can do.
Hmm.
Like it's true. Like uh there are these two groups, they're fighting to perpetuate an inequality which they're fighting in a way which will end up perpetuating an inequality which ultimately is bad for a group I identify with. But, I have no power to change that fact. Maybe I don't think collectively we could, who knows? In any case, the best I can do is try and ensure the group I think is better wins.
I don't find that a ridiculous thought.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's why it's like it's cynical in the sense of not really believing in much political agency to change the situation, but it's non-cynical in that you could then sincerely throw yourself behind either the repenters or the oppressors. Here's, for instance, my guess is that Thomas Sowell sincerely, like he's 100% beloved of repressor intelligentsia.
Right.
I also think he genuinely, sincerely believes the things he's saying, and I just think he thinks the best thing that could happen for and this is how we phrase it, like the best thing that could happen for non-white people, black people especially in America, is who he's concerned with, would be for like broadly conservative policies to win out and for the grievances of the past to no longer be focused on so much, and then at least some black people would be able to make it in the marketplace. And
Or to give another example, Glenn Lowry, who's
Ben
a
Lowry, yep, another fully. I think he's fully sincere. He advocates what he wants. I actually don't believe this case. There's who was it? It's the chap who did the Reactionary Mind book, I believe. But he wrote the piece arguing that Clarence Thomas, if you examine his writings, Clarence Thomas, the Supreme Court Justice. Um,
Corey Robin.
yeah, Corey Robin. He believes of Clarence Thomas in my terminology. I would say that he's like this. He's a sort of like very cynical, almost to the point
Hmm.
of Afro pessimist, very cynical. But then he believes within that the best you can do is hope that one of these sides wins, and I'm going to advocate for the.
I think
Like,
the
I actually
one
don't buy that. I think Clarence Thomas is just on the make, but whatever. Right?
I think Clarence Thomas is also genuinely deranged, but that is a whole
Um,
other story. I mean, I think to maybe add something to your prior point about like, these are the teams and they're not perfect, but one is better. I mean, I think while for the Glenn Lowrys of the world, and I've had Glenn on the show and I like Glenn, but obviously very much disagree with him. Like, I don't quite buy his perspective. I think the sort of like on the sort of liberal side, that's sort of where I land at the end of the day. Like, I would add to that, it's not just strategic, it's also political ideologies aren't just sets of goals, they're languages for describing the world in. And there is an element of like efficacy. You pick the language that you think will be intelligible to people, that will be persuasive, that is just the one that's available to you. You can talk about, like, should we bring back this ancient Greek conception of virtue or something, and maybe, but at a certain level, if you really tried to bring ancient Greek thought back, it just wouldn't be intelligible to people. It's not how we think anymore. And, like, a lot of the reason I land in liberalism as a camp is that is just the language that you can talk to not everyone, but most people in, and they will understand what you're saying. And so when it comes to like, let's just call it the woke language, you can imagine a thought of, okay, this is the emergent discourse within which we can advocate for ourselves. Fine. And then I think, to my mind, I think to many people's mind, it seemed to stutter out and kind of fail. And like, c'est la vie. Okay, that's no longer the language to advocate in. It might have been once. I don't think is now. I think a more just basic liberal rights and freedoms is sort of where we're at. Whether or not that's better or worse in any absolute sense, it's just that's the language that people are going to hear you in.
could well be. Um, well, in terms of the well,
Bracket what I said about
yeah,
liberalism, but these are just languages,
yeah.
that's part of it. And like, there's nothing wrong with saying this is the language I can talk in to reach the most people. That's a perfectly sensible thought.
Yes, precisely so. And like so on the more liberal side, or more closer to the repenter side of my terminology,
Yeah.
Charles Mills, is an odd case where he was he was very explicit. So by the end of his life, he's writing books defending liberal political philosophy and liberal political action. And he's someone who's very clear. That was in the way you just put it. Like his claim was, you know, at some point in the latter half of the 20th century, it's become pretty clear that the Soviet Union's not going to work out and it's is not going to reform itself into something better. And like at that point, that was the other rival game in town to de jure racism.
Mm,
Now the liberal states, and so the thing to do is make liberalism work because it's a language which you can talk to people and they will understand. I mean, he would use the kind of things you just said. So like yeah, like that would be someone who like would appeal more to repenter sensibilities and was doing it with this in mind, and even with this talk of like, well, it's a language you can talk, which will make sense to people and you can get something out of it. And it was just born of a sense of what has and hasn't worked and what will and will not be a viable project going forward. Um, the two other things I would say, the third of the things is I I do think there is some degree, like as I said, like I think lots of people are sincere either because the thing you just said, it's the team's available and I've got to pick the one I can make most difference on, or because it's easy to equate one's own uh advancement within a structure and an anti-racist good if one is oneself non-white. I do think there is also just a certain degree of like self-interested cynicism. I don't think
Mm.
that's never happening. But finally, I think that sort of a little bit like not quite that, but just the other thing to do is, especially when you're younger, you just adopt the language and mode of what seems to be how do the people who are doing things which I like more than other things speak?
Yeah.
What's what's the way of doing things which is in, and I think so. I think another common way in is just that is so if you say it's unreflective, that sounds meaner than I intend it to be. It's just normal to be socialized into a certain way of thinking and speaking, and to do that
Yeah.
relatively unreflectively. And so I think that doesn't require it's not a thoughtful endorsement for reasons, but it's also not cynical and bad. It's just normal human sociality. I think that was a lot of the way in. But a couple of other things I would say that was first, one thing I would say is just because people often want, so when I'm talking to repenters, you typically get like, look, actually, the repressors, why would you think this is for the best? They want to repress talk of racism because they don't, they don't like being made to feel guilty about doing racist stuff when they want, and that's it. I will say, on at least some issues, I actually think they did have so the thing I end up advocating for is a sort of detached, non-committed persona. Well, non-aligned, I think I call it like that on a Cold War analogy, the non-aligned persona, where you sort of like if you are trying to, given that this thing is not orientated around advancing the interests of the vast majority of people in the world, really, the best approach to it is to not let it decide what stance you want to take and to cultivate a kind of detachment, which if you see that part of fiction, I start quoting the Stoics a lot. I've noticed of you that you often draw on ancient authors. I want to ask you about that, but like in that section, I'm
Please.
drawing on the Stoics a lot and some kind of like, I with try and withhold my passions and consider what to endorse and what not based on a independently formulated idea of the good. And at least sometimes I think the repressor answer will turn out to be the better one. The one of those I had in mind, which was very motivating me in writing the paper actually, is I thought a lot of the debates about removing standardized testing, this also came up in the Woke blog post, I thought a lot of them were incredibly cynical on the repenter side. That was a case where you had like upper middle class parents in the United States, like in California, say, where it's got a bit of advancement, asking to like remove forms of assessment. You can give like an anti-racist line to it, but remove forms of assessment, but not to replace that with like, we're going to randomize college admissions.
Hmm.
It was being replaced with like personal statements and essays. And you can like those things are way easier to game if you are a rich person who can like go join the
No,
polo.
I agree with you here. And
And so like that was because with the defense of standardized testing, it was the repressors who were saying like, no, the more facially neutral, non-politically one.
once you get into admissions, and this can either be college, but this can an area in my personal life I've spent a bit of time working on. It can also be like how you hire and promote people. Once you get into that, that's where you can really get this, let's just call it woke for the sake of
Yeah.
simplicity. That's where you can really get this woke language being misused, I think. Because, like I say, it is a language and you can use that language to say different things. And I think there are, yeah, some areas where we can critique on a philosophical level the idea of equality of opportunity and meritocracy and so on. But that they're not totally vacuous concepts either, right? And there's a difference between making those things better and just eroding those protections altogether. And there are certainly cases where the language of woke was used to just erode those protections altogether, I think.
That's actually a point where I found myself. So I have found myself. Uh, I am actually. I'm Yes, I basically found myself going through this where, in my opinion, our ability to assess merit on the one part, and second, which of course will always be relative to a goal and nature of the task you're doing,
Hmm.
and second, the desirability of like the effort it would take to do that thing well compared with the gain of like the marginally how much better it would be to have the third best person versus the seventh best
Mm.
person is pretty small. And so I tend to think that very often kind of the merit-based element of an assessment procedure should be like relatively minimal. It's like a can you do this job? If I gave you this
Mm.
job, you'd be able to just competently carry out the tasks on
Mm.
basic level. Once you do that, we then should randomize. And so like I wanted like much more use of lotteries in our
People who
distribution.
hire for jobs and people who select people for college will never, ever, ever, ever go for that.
Yeah, not in a million years, right? My thinking of this came out because I actually most of my work is not on political philosophy; it's on social epistemology of science. I'm thinking a lot about grants,
Mm.
handing out money to do scientific research. I think our ability to pick like the best project, let alone the third best project, compared to the 20th best project, is actually pretty minimal. And the
Mm.
effort we put into that is effort wasted from people who could be doing science in the meantime. And we'd be far better off just being like, is this perhaps a viable project that we can make assessments on? And once we've done that, having lottery systems. That has been tried out and has had some success in various places. So I would defend it. And I generalize that. Basically, my experience of hiring is I tend to find that once we get to the interview stage, I can have a favorite. I'll have favorites. I like the people we've hired. But I typically do believe that the counterfactual where we hire any of the other people into, they would all have done the job fine. It's very rare that I come away thinking that's true. However, I have found two things. One, 0% chance. No one agrees with me on this. It's a political dead end, so I don't bother pushing for it anymore because it's not worth my time to do that. Second, everyone who heard me say I don't think meritocracy is a very good way of doing things, I think we should do, always heard me as saying we should replace that with a vibe test on how woke you are, um, which I can, nothing at all. Not even slightly what I'm going for. But the reason they did that is because in this era, that was the alternative, right? It was I will break down the meritocratic procedure and replace it with a vibe test on how woke you are, or
I
various.
think particularly troubling in the case of college admissions is that actually does seem to be legally the route that we've gone. So the Supreme Court case that ended, I would say transformed rather than ended, affirmative action in the American university system, the name of which I forget. But in that, John Roberts says you can't use race as a just putting a weight on the scale. You can't just say we need this GPA, but we'll add 10 points if you're black or whatever. You can't do that. But what you can do is look at personal essays. And if someone writes a particularly compelling personal essay about their experiences of racism, well, that you could take into account. And I just think then you've just gone from flawed to much worse because you can argue about the merits. And I think there's cases on both sides of like just give 10 points to every black person, right? You can argue about that. But that's a system. Whereas now what you have is every black applicant is now going to have to write an essay on their experiences of racism and how it made them feel that will then be read by an upper middle class white repenter, to
Yeah.
use your language.
Yeah.
And they have to not necessarily authentically express themselves, but find the language that they think will appeal to someone who's actually potentially quite far removed from their life experiences. And maybe that's just not where their skill set is and what they're interested in. Maybe they're a freaking engineering student and like what they're really good at expressing and saying doesn't actually have anything to do with racism that they may or may not have experienced. It seems like an awful alternative. And to be fair, that was the Republicans on the court who did that. But it's that sort of logic of like it's how authentically you can speak to your experience has been embraced by a lot of people on the repenter side too. It just seems like the worst of both worlds to me.
No, needless to say, I don't. Yeah, I don't think the status quo ante was good, but nor do I think what happened after it is good. Yeah, I have sort of for reasons you just said. I mean, there's on the status quo ante. The fact that Harvard did try and argue in court that Asian people have a statistically worse personality. I mean, they should be embarrassed for themselves that that was ever. I quickly online argument. Internet's favorite punching bag, Matt Iglesias, actually has quite a good essay on Harvard in particular. Anyway, he broke down what the admissions procedure looked like, and he had basically if you looked at who got in, if you were to sort of compare the hypothetical world, he was responding to academics work. I just don't remember who the academics were. But if you compare the hypothetical world where it was just on test scores, there were basically more black people and Hispanic people in Harvard than you would have expected from that, less Asian people than you would have expected that, and about the same number of white people. And
Mm,
the reason is there's a whole swathe of legacy admissions, admissions to the polo team, like admissions because you
mm.
got a parent who's a professor there. Those are 99% going to white people.
Yeah.
And that is to such a great degree that it makes up whatever. So really what's going on is we redistributed from Asian people and poorer white people or less well-connected white people to black and Hispanic people, and then largely richer black and Hispanic people. Um, because it was held as an absolute constraint on this system that richer and well-connected white people have to get their places are just protected by fiat. And he's like, surely no one would defend this system on merits, right? Like no one's idea of a good system is the
The
thing we're doing.
problem is with affirmative action that it's become something, not the problem, merely a feature of the affirmative action debate is particularly in the American. It's actually not something Brits obsess over as
Yeah,
much.
it's not as much a feature of our politics. This is a point where like the American, it's the peculiarities of their legal history have made this much more salient to them than it is really to us.
It's kind of a totem for like whose team are you on? It's a stand-in. And so when people ask, do you favour affirmative action? They're not, I think, a lot of the time asking the sort of granular level details about what specific percentage of which group. They're asking, do you believe that America, the history of American racism and its enduring effects are real? Right, that's the question you're being asked. And so when I'm asked that question, do you agree with affirmative action? I just say yes, because I'm answering the actual question that's being asked. Do I believe that, you know, the enduring effects of American racism are real today? Yeah, that seems a very obvious fact to me, right?
I mean,
That
this is why
America,
you're a better person than me. I'm always tempted to start arguing about the details because
I,
I
I,
do know what they're asking and I just don't want to.
yeah, but then positionality, that's gonna just read a bit differently as a white guy.
Yeah,
No.
it's very true.
Um, but then, yeah, when you get into how, I also think there's a thing. If in my recent New Republic piece, I say liberals have got themselves in a position where they know they have to favour affirmative action, but they don't know why. And I think you see that contradiction in the type of stuff that Harvard argues. Because I think when we've both been talking, and I think we both have our potential concerns with, right? This. But where did it, do you think the narrative from many people is that the sort of era of woke is over? And certainly if you look at how this language was, it seems like there was something of a high watermark from what, 2012 to 2014? Like that sort of era, very roughly ballparking it. And it's kind of just faded out step by step. Um, is it still, there's still certainly the repenter pathology, if you want to call it that, but this particular set of cultural artifacts that you could call like high wokeness does really seem to have fallen by the wayside a bit.
Yeah, well, I don't think I think the repenter repressor dynamic predates and will outlive the specific idiom and special concerns of yeah, like the sort of that era of I put the 2014 to 2020 was when we're picking around the same kind of time, like
Yeah.
that sort of era.
Yeah,
Um,
it's an artifact of that, isn't it?
yeah, and my suspicion is that the a special focus on the particular like the particular language at the level of like those phrases and those mannerisms. That's probably going. The particular focus on I think I mean some of these I don't think are going to, right? So for instance, there's no way that in American politics we've seen the last of the issue of police brutality,
Mm,
just because since they've had a modern police force every few years, there's a flare up of this thing because it tends to be quite militarized and does
mm,
brutal things and people don't like it. I think we saw a recent flare up. Basically, my suspicion is because a few things happened at once, one of which was widespread access to camera phones and social media.
mm.
just led to a new round of outrage about this. Eventually, there'll be something else. Some cop will publish a manifesto where they explain here's why beating up homeless people is good, and then
Mm.
there'll be another round of right. So I don't think we've seen the last of that. It's just that, yeah, the way we spoke about it and the unusual degree of salience it had in politics is probably likely to change. Um, you mentioned, I'm kind of curious. You said you think it's done more good than harm. Can you say more about why? Because my own take was that my own take is probably is pretty neutral, really. Where it's good is I think it was more just almost epiphenomenal. Like, I mean, I think that like as you get more members of various groups who've been excluded coming into various professional spaces, you're gonna have an awkward position time when like norms change, where like jokey, overly sexual talk in the workplace kind of just has to go away because now there are people who are
Mm.
very uncomfortable with that, and you got to change that. Like when I was younger, like I think I mentioned this like in the UK, and should say like casual homophobia, like using gay as a synonym for bad, was just
Universal.
universal, like completely normal in a way which I think would be very shocking to younger people now. And I think it's like good that that's just gone. I mean, as those groups got more acceptance.
100%.
And so like that's I think the big win of woke is that as those groups got more accepted, not unrelatedly, but to do with independent process, we were just going to have an awkward period of cultural transition where everyone realizes, oh, you can't do that as much anymore.
Yeah, I think that's all I'm saying there with that
Yeah,
claim.
okay, well, connects we agree. Like, yeah.
Yeah, so like, I'm not. 2 points. One, I'm just going on a very sort of utilitarian balancing, and obviously you've got to kind of eyeball these things at quite a high level, right? Is all of the frustrations of woke at the end of the day, how yes, it was used cynically. Yes, Sarah Rao defrauded some wealthy white women. How much do I honestly care about that? Like certainly you can put them on the weights, but on the other, it was a movement that sort of put its back to the you can't just use gay as an insult anymore, right? And ultimately, was it the only thing that put its back to that? I think no, I think it was sort of happening anyway, but it did put its back to that.
Yep, I agree.
My ballpark is that one edges the other out.
Yeah.
But the other reason I'm perhaps more inclined to defend woke than you might be is I've been a part of a series of debates we've had in America on like what is the cause of Trump. And I've been very much on a side arguing against what I call reaction narratives. So, do we see Trump as like a course correction against liberal or left excesses? Or do we see it as something a gentle that has ideas and values of its own? And I've been very much on the this isn't a gentle side, right? So there's very much a narrative around woke that woke went too far and that caused Trump. And my view is those are just quite separate things. Woke may very well have had its excesses and dead ends, but what the people in the Trump movement aren't, they're not, the guy in the diner in Ohio, when he talks about wokeness, he's not personally seeing the college kids doing a stupid demo. He's seeing that filtered through conservative news or the Daily Wire or the videos he watches online, right? And I think you see that really clearly in the UK case, where not race, but similar sort of dynamic, where transphobia went from like not to say we weren't prejudiced, but not a thing that was part of our politics at all, to like an overriding psychosis in like 3 years. And I
Yeah.
think the reason for that was the right-wing media really latched. It wasn't a reaction to anything objective. It was a reaction to right-wing propaganda, essentially. And what Starmer's doing now, trying to appease in many senses, both on race and trans issues and any number of things, is not working for him politically. But that's what my model of the world would suggest, which is that the sort of anti-woke concerns aren't coming from a direct contact from a thing. They're coming from the way that thing is presented to them in right-wing media. And so you can't I'm very skeptical of the reaction narrative because, as much as anything for its practical effects, I think East Starmer's a great example of this. What you end up doing is enacting bad policy that hurts vulnerable people to no obvious strategic gain because it wasn't policy that was causing it in the first place. So, anyway, that's a summary of a very long and complex series of debates. But what that does mean is when people complain about wokeness, while I'm not always super keen to defend it on its own terms, when it's in this view of look at what you made the bigots do, I'll almost always challenge that. And so then that just in terms of a conversational dynamic then puts me on the side of defending woke. And so I'm sort of used to defending woke, even though there's plenty of stuff in there that I'm like, yeah, like cultural appropriation, yeah, that's a weird umbrella term that doesn't make any sense, you know? But like just because I've been so entrenched in those debates, I'm much more circumspect. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. I also, I mean, I just agree. The sort of non-agential view of the right, is so incredibly puzzling to me. Like I share your sense of um pretty clearly where, as you say, where woke is you being firing people up on the right. Apparently, that's very mediated via an industry designed to find examples of people doing bad things and then obsess over them constantly and hype up exactly how bad it would be. And if you make your agenda of like, yes, I from the center left will strike down on this, all you do is vindicate the sense of that indeed that was a serious problem and make it the subject of political discussion. And
Hmm.
I also think British transphobia, which really has been an elite-driven project, is like a fascinating example of this because they still talk themselves into this is a response to some excess happening somewhere, despite it being a tiny number of the population, amount of the population who are basically harmless. And if you just didn't focus on it so much, it would not be this issue. And so, like, yeah, they've managed to themselves into an issue where it's obviously not a response to anything objective. It is definitely an elite-driven project. Yes. So fully agree on all those points. It's simply that I also think it didn't do much on good on the merits. I mean, I think the woke era was often smaller incremental thing. In some ways, as you said, like the woke era in many ways was the organized political expression of the repenter psychology. And my view of that is always that even if that thing wins, it's not that good. And
Yeah,
so, and they didn't always win, for one thing. And where
it
they did
clearly
win,
freaking hasn't, has it?
yeah, exactly right. Yeah. And so like, and where they did win, I usually, it was okay. I'm usually more in favor of the changes they like than not. Not always. The school admissions case, the university admissions case is an example where I don't think so. But often I am. And so yeah, but like you're right. Like the counter narrative that they're actually the kind of look what you made me do abusive husband, but there's an entire political movement rhetoric. I hate that with a burning passion. So I'm with you on that.